So it said that the Parah Adumah evades any attempt at human cognition or cognizing, but not totally. So let's try to treat the Parah Adumah as a concept of the end of history and superimpose both Hegelian and Heideggerian and Spenglerian end of history onto the end of history, which belongs to the Parah Adumah. So, or the red heifer. So it said that this I'll just give quickly some bullet points on the things said about the Parah Adumah, and not so much as someone with faith or Adumah, but rather with as somebody thinking from the point of view of philosophy. But I don't think the difference is all that great. It's just that at a certain point, as with the concept of infinity, a jug of milk crashes on the, like in the stupid Tarkovsky movie, a jug of milk crashes on the table, and then the milk is spreading out over the table, and it's spreading out forever. And you can kind of understand that, but scientifically, infinity, you couldn't possibly make it an object of study because it's supposed to go on forever, and that's not something you could. It seems like in principle that it just makes no sense to make that an object of study. How would you have a machine to measure it, or how would it be measured? Maybe, but it's just a sort of doubt that sort of opens up in the same way with these other subjects. So it said that we have a mitzvah that's, or we have a, sorry, we have a mysterious oral tradition, which presents itself as saying, oh, there's some things that you guys would come up with on your own. One, the sixth commandment, for instance, supposedly we come up with that on our own. The idea of Homo Necans, or the killing human being as a killing being, sort of speaks against that. And the reason I was thinking about that is because it's the Parah Adumah, or the red heifer, is a sacrifice, and the idea of the one idea of how animal sacrifices began was that they were originally, there was human killing emerged out of non-killing animal, and that defined us, and then we substituted the animal sacrifice for human sacrifice. Although, of course, human sacrifice, according to Fraser, still went on in the Golden on the Lake of Nemi and all that. And of course, it still went on in Carthage. Or it's thought to now. It was some people, liberals as it were, amongst the philologists, said, oh no, there's a slander against the Carthaginians by the Romans, and then it was reversed, and people that now take the opinion that the Carthaginians actually did do human sacrifice. But okay, now forget about all that. Parah Adumah is supposed to be not something we could derive directly, like the prohibition against murder, because it simply somehow makes sense to us, or like something which, even though we wouldn't come up, supposedly we wouldn't come, I don't think that makes sense myself. By the way, the sixth commandment is obviously, because of the distinction between killing and murder, it's actually not at all clear. It's radically unclear. And it's a constant, in fact, it's constantly menacing us. So that's bullshit. But that's what's usually said by the rabbis. And then second, they say there's other things like the week, the 7-day week, which we derive from revealed text, 7 days of the creation. Hashem rests on the seventh day, and we wouldn't have derived that on our own. And the proof is that other cultures have different weeks of different duration. That it's somewhat unclear, even with the 7-day week is the best, unless you have some kind of faith in Hashem. It seems to me it's still not totally rational. They claim it's rational. It makes some sense, but maybe experimentation would find out that a 7.5-day week in conditions where you didn't have to worry about the exact 24-hour day, if it is an exact 24-hour day, maybe it would be better. Who knows? But then they say there's some other of these oral tradition commandments, which we're supposed to follow chiefly because our Adumah, our faith in Hashem, and in a certain way, because it doesn't make obvious sense. Why red? Who cares? Why red? And so in a certain way, because the Parah, Adumah, it requires us to do things that Hashem thinks are so great. That is part of the point. That's part of the point, according to them. And therefore, this is supposed to be this is supposed to be actually the most mysterious one, the most one that makes less sense for a reason. And one of them is why red? Who cares? But and also the whole thing, why ashes, etc. But then you find out there's all these explanations that have been given, and they're actually taken as authoritative mostly. So that Moses has been, he was a little bit late when he was getting the tablets for the Decalogue, and then the golden calf was built and worshipped, and the golden calf was essentially not Baal or something like that, but it was actually just a replacement for Moshe or Moses. And this seems to be the origin, because they like to say from Moshe to Moshiach, Moshiach being the anointed one, since they don't consider Christ to be, they consider Christ somebody that took the wrong path, but there's still going to be this Moshiach or anointed one, the Messiah or Messiah. So from Moses to Moshiach, there's supposed to be 10 of these red heifers, or Adumahs. And what they do is they're kind of like the Greeks with miasma. It's not exactly it's not the same as a question of sin or error, but it's more like a question of pollution, and it has to do with contact with the dead, but not necessarily direct contact. But anybody who's been to a cemetery or been around been fairly close to a dead body is said to have tumah, or have contracted this pollution or radioactivity or whatever. And then the ashes, so then they say the red heifer, which under certain strict conditions, it's supposed to have every hair is supposed to be red, and it's supposed to be over a certain age, and the ritual has to be conducted in a certain way, and I think it has to actually be conducted on the Mount of Olives near Mount Morah, near the Temple Mount, and then the Kohanim, or one Kohen, or priest, has to do something. I think the one who slaughters it doesn't have to be a Kohen, but anyway, there's all these stipulations, such that, but anyway, let's not get into that right now. I'm going to circle back to that. But the point I wanted to make to begin with is that this is meant to bring about the end of history in a certain sense. They don't express it that way, but I'm superimposing the notion of the Hegelian end of history and the notion of the end of history of the Abendlands. So let's get to the second. Let's give a brief summary of the two other versions here. So I take Abendlands to be something like the West in the sense of the Western world, in the sense of Christianity, the Christendom, as they say. And Heidegger was actually a Catholic. So Heidegger speaks of the Geschichte des Abendlandes, so the genitive, so it's like the fate of the West, or the destiny, I think that's the nicest phrase, destiny of the West, but more literally destiny of the evening land, where the Levant is the land of the rising land, because the Levant has something to do with levitation. I mean, the words are related to like levitation, levity, going up. And that's, Heidegger speaks of Geschichte des Abendlands, but the famous title of Spengler, so let's think of Spengler as like the second decayed version of Hegel, taking over Hegel's thesis, but after Hegel's thesis has long since been no longer believed in, no longer taken seriously. So all the time I look at it this way. What is actually taught to the young is what's taken seriously. It's all fine and well to say, yeah, we privately believe in this or that, but what's actually taught in the schools and in the universities is what's the culture really takes seriously. So if they don't teach Hegel as the truth in the university, understand? And neither did they teach Spengler. Now, Spengler, they almost teach as the truth. So, for instance, in the anthropology department, they teach Spengler as the truth. More or less. And so far as Spengler corresponds to Boas and corresponds to Malinowski and corresponds to the idea of difference rather than hierarchy and corresponds to post-Fraser. Fraser is the last whipping boy of the people that still believed in the hierarchy of cultures, that literacy is superior to pre-literacy. They still use the term pre-literacy in a lot of fields, but it's challenged because it sounds too teleological, it sounds too Hegelian, too much like we're making progress towards the end of history. Of course, even in ancient times, it would have been understood. The literate civilizations, there's the concept of civilization is much older than Hegel, of course. It's related to cult, to culture, and therefore to the sense of the superiority of the cultured or civilized to the barbarians or uncivilized. Hegel simply gives us a specific expression on a theory of how this happens and how it comes to an end, and a claim to prove that it comes to an end at a certain point, with Napoleon being the last universal historical figure. But what does Spengler talk about, right? We know he talks about the decline of the West. So here's where the parallelism comes in with Heidegger's formula. Spengler speaks of the Untergang des Abendlands. also a genitive. So the downgoing is begot by the Abendland itself, by its innermost substantive character. This thing which is interdane substantive, this grammatical thinking. So they still have the grammatical thinking in the ancient grammatical thinking in Hegel. Basically, Spengler could have been aware of that, but he wasn't, so he's a little bit boring in a certain sense. I think some of the contempt for Spengler is because he's a little bit like, there's the questions of what language is and what role language plays in, which of course they were already raised in the 19th century, and the famous essay by the Frenchman, What is a Nation? A nation is a daily plebiscite, had something to do with this post-Herder sense of language is the most important thing, and therefore 1848 should be organized around language, and that affected Americans also. For instance, that we used to have a universal, before 1848, the way the deaf were treated was different. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that sign language was around 1848 proscribed and considered, utterly proscribed by the nationalist types, because they thought we must have lip reading, because it will be lip reading of English, and the deaf, did I say the blind? The deaf, but the deaf should definitely do lip reading rather than sign language, according to these 1848 people in America, or around that time when there was a nationalism was coming up. And there was other such, effects of the 1848 nationalism, which in some cases had to do with language, and everything being corresponding to language, and then the hyper-consciousness of language and language problems started at that time, not at the, as we're told now, at the time of Bertrand Russell, or what's the other guy that did How to Do Things with the Words, the teacher of John Searle. But this is an old question. I mean, not that old, 19th century, 18th century Herder. And Spengler, but in other words, Spengler wasn't aware of, wasn't really on top of a question that was, he could have been on top of, and that makes him kind of boring. And I think that contributes to the contempt some people have for Spengler. But this formula of the Untergang des Abendlands, which is deliberately like, so in German one would say Untergang der Zone, which is also a genitive formulation, and that would be translated as just setting of the sun. But it's like, so there could be a theme here of whether the fact that in English we don't really care about the difference between genitive and possessive matters. We could express that in English, but it's not usually, grammarians don't make a big deal about it. Like whether you have an apostrophe with an S to sun's setting, or rather than the setting of the sun, sun setting, possessive, setting of the sun, genitive, formally, but maybe not understood that way by a native speaker anyway. But I think also in German, this doesn't make that much difference anymore, as it did for Spengler, and as it did for Heidegger, and it did for Prussian scholarship. It made more sense because it was connected to the substantive, and to the idea that the nature of the thing was begetting something. So we should think about that in Heidegger, the nature of the Abendland the nature of das Abendland is begetting this destiny or Geschichte. Whereas in the other case, we're getting the same nature in Spengler is said to be begetting this this end of itself. So like a tree, I mean, just as redwood tree, even though it lives very long. I mean, this is the supposed criticism of Spengler, that he has this prolonged biological metaphor, just as a tree lives a certain life, then a certain notion of the Western world, really meaning the sort of Northern European descendants of the Western Empire from 1054 or whatever. I'm not sure how Spengler actually be the first date of it is for him, but the Faustian society has a certain date where it will reach its most superlative, idyllic moment, its Heimat, and then it will drop away. Whereas in Hegel, the Heimat is supposed to be forever, but then one wonders what you do when you get to this this Hegelian end, which after all is only it's rather modest. As like Hegel says, there's still going to be a lot of problems, but that's like the best society you're going to get. And it's basically it's complicated to say. I shouldn't go into that now, but it's complicated to say, like, from one point of view, Hegel is extremely liberal, and because for the free speech, which could, so like, it could be expressed, so it was recommended to me to express it as a euphemism, but I'm not sure if I'm not really at ease in the sense, if one is to say freedom of speech is really the freedom to lie, then that sounds like a euphemism. It's just a nice way to say it. But I don't think, I'm not really at ease with expressing it that way, because it's sort of the different question. It's more like, if the freedom of speech is actually going to lead to the end of history and something good, so that all the bullshit and Trump actually, through the constant metastasizing of his lies, would lead to something good being established, then freedom of speech and freedom to lie, I mean, then freedom to lie would not be such a bad thing, and freedom of speech would also express the same thing, simply in a positive way, or it would simply express a different aspect of the same thing. But okay, so we have these different notions of end of history, and Heidegger, what is Heidegger's, but in Hegel, so in Spengler, it's just that the Faustian society is going to die off. The sun rose at some point, and it's going to set at some point according to its innermost nature, so its substantive nature. Whereas in Hegel, it's supposed to reach this absolute monism is supposed to be achieved. And in Heidegger, there's no monism, and there's no, because there's no sub-theory of a substance. But there's only the so-called Ereignis, or as Agamben calls it, the opening. And then history is not understood as the movement of the ideas across the centuries, as it is in Hegel, but as what lasts, what has this, what essences, and what's essencing with the most ferocity now is the religion of accelerationism, And so when I say this, I'm widely criticized because they say, oh, well, that's, you're only speaking according to yourself. But I'm not. But what I'm saying is, that's what we teach everyone. That's what everyone is into. So there's the people that I hear, these people that say, oh, we're against the materialists, blah, blah, blah. And actually they're really into science, and they want to know everything about the latest developments of science, because that's how they were educated all their lives. So the fact that we have the cybernetic essence means that's how everybody was brought up, and whatever your innermost conviction is, other than that, that's not, there's something in science that's goes beyond any individual. And we participate in that, and our Dasein is part of this cybernetic essence. And the cybernetic essence, since Heidegger, has evolved into the, so to speak, into the accelerationism, which is now everywhere, marching over the earth and all its people. I mean, the latest overt expression of that, I think, is the investment in the AI futures. So all money has been directed towards AI futures. There's 1,000-fold as much money in the markets as there is in the real economy, and it has to go somewhere, so it's all being directed towards AI. That's the proof of accelerationism. That's what our culture is. So you could express that still in Spenglerian terms as a Faustian ambition. In 30,000 years, we'll still be waiting for the latest iPhone. And nothing essential will have changed, but there'll be changes which won't have touched our Dasein in a way that changes it from having this so-called technological or cybernetic essence. But on the other hand, there could be the Parah Adumah. So this is the question of the 10th part. So what I wanted to circle back to is, one thing is just a practical question of Parah Adumah is that everyone today is Tuma, or so-called as pollution, so that there's really nobody who could do the Parah Adumah ritual according to what they say on the Mount of Olives, because everybody is already contaminated. There's some people saying, oh, there's some stipulation that a public ritual under certain circumstances can be. I just saw a video that said this. It's on my X stream. There could be, it doesn't really matter if the person is ritually cleansed by the ashes or by the, apparently how they did it is, the reason there could only be 10, I mean, the reason there only needed to be 10, like that one Parah Adumah could last for hundreds of years or 100 years or whatever, is because the ashes could be mixed with the water, and then the mere contact of the water with the ashes was sufficient, and then you just add more water, and then every time somebody has tuma or contact with the dead, then you just put the 7 drops, I think it's 7 drops of water on them by the Kohen, and then there's some complicated things beyond that about how the Kohen that does it contracts a tuma and it switches over, and then the last one to absolve the last one has to do something. There's some way out of that. But the practical question is there anybody that doesn't have tuma or contact with it? I mean, because just being in a cemetery, or it's worse than that, I think. It's just like, you can't get it from the womb accordingly. The womb is like Eden. It's has no death in it. But once you're out of the womb, immediately you come into contact with your mother who has tuma, because she's been to a cemetery or she's been in contact with the death. And everybody is, apparently in Israel, they tried to get out of this in some bubble boy type of thing, and then the secular authorities came in and broke that up. So I don't really know how the ceremony could even be properly carried out, and maybe it supposedly already has been, but that sounds dubitative to me. But in any case, let's think for a second. I want to think about what is the process. So we know what the process of history is in Hegel. It's this dialectical process, and the idea is moving towards its completion, and it's the tragedy of history, and it's the cunning of the historical spirit and all that. But what is it in this Parah? What is it in this? I hesitate to say. I don't think it has to do with Judaism, because to me Judaism means I don't think it has to do with the rabbinic tradition. So the rabbinic tradition has to do with the end of the temple traditions. It has to do with the diaspora, and has to do with other things. But the original temple tradition, I mean, taking that we have an oral tradition that goes back supposedly to Abraham, and this is confirmed by DNA that the people with the name Cohen, who were related to the original priests or Kohanim, exist. That confirms the historical and the DNA evidence and the archaeological evidence all seem to suggest that. So maybe we have a good oral tradition. That's probably true. So the Parah Adumah is accurate tradition, but I don't think I think it's a tradition of the first temple, or it must be prior to the first temple. Moses is long prior to the first temple. It's prior to David, but because they say from Moses to Moshiach, and Moshiach is supposed to be somehow a descendant of David, but and in fact they suppose Christ is considered to be a descendant of David, but they were not talking about Christ, or because that's the funny thing too, because the rabbis don't accept that, but we don't actually have any Kohanim, I don't think. Are there actually legitimate Kohanim? That's another problem. So who is supposed to bring the ritual to its completion? But how's this tradition understood? So it's understood that Eden, the whole thing is about life and death. So the death is a pollution, and in Eden there's no contact between good and evil. There's no contact between it's pure life or eternal life, and this contact hasn't, this pollution hasn't begun yet, and the need to for Adumah, or for faith in Hashem, hasn't started yet. There's no need for it in Eden. So yeah, this reminds me of Heideggerian individuation. That's what I would make a parallel. So Heidegger sometimes writes about individuation of the Dasein. And the end of it is unclear what will happen at the end of it. I would say, so this is where I would say the scientific, the sort of rationalistic or philosophic reasoned view doesn't really exclude us from the religious view. I think the same view that Dostoevsky has proved, that could happen, because obviously, even if you think just evolution, just in terms of evolution, the early hominids are a different type of being than our Dasein, and animals are a different kind of being than our Dasein. And that's, even though we can't stay with that idea because it's too simple and too obvious, it's just as much a religious idea as it is an idea of reason. Whatever these simple-minded people like Noah Harari will tell you that it's a story. But that doesn't make any sense, because all human speech and all human intelligibility is just with as much justice called a story. That's just a negative way of saying it. The people that don't believe what I believe are have the folk talk as the folk do and tell stories, and we, the serious realists, have a different view. That's it's rank nonsense, because one person acts on one principle, another on another, and it's both their action and both are real. And if you're a realist, you have to pay attention to both. So it's just nonsense. Let me say one thing about the Greek tradition here, is that in the Greek mythos, in the move from mythos to olethes, we get this notion that originally in the Golden Age or the Prelapsarian Age or whatever, their animals and whatever kind of being Ardos is were basically the same and spoke together, and then there was a division. I think that's both in Plato's Statesman and in Hesiod and in other probably countryside sources. We shouldn't underestimate in China the countryside sources, the fox religions and all that stuff. And the same way in Greece, I mean, because we're told that official religions were Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, but actually there's all kinds of other stuff in China. Just the same in archaic Greece, there's all kinds of stuff and all kinds of sources of where these things came from, not just a few authors like Hesiod and Plato. So I think that's not sure that I can develop this to do a Entwicklung Fähigkeit, as it were, on this. I'm not sure if this. I'm not sure if this has a capacity to be developed that I can right now develop, but I wanted to set it down to possibly develop this and ask how can we superimpose Heidegger onto this situation, and suggest possibly the statement about only a God can save us is in play, where of course he didn't say only the God or only God can save us, but only a God can save us, which surely requires interpretation.